Buenos Aires Conference is this very interesting institution. Lots of different words are used to describe what I'll be talking about. Coordination, coherence, horizontal management. These are all important ways of thinking about the same topic. But the basic idea here is trying to get public programs to work together to serve citizens. Now, but we're faced with a very important balancing act in all of this. So I'll be talking about coordination, but you could have someone here tomorrow who could be talking about specialization, because there are virtues in both of these. That is, we want organizations that are specialized and know exactly what they're doing and concentrate on the topic. At the same time, we want coordination, coherence, connection among them. It's a very difficult balancing act to produce. So in the book that Jose Luis kindly mentioned on the 7 European countries, what we did was to map the swings back and forth in different countries. So if they were highly coordinated, they found out they needed to be specialized. And if they were very specialized, they found out they needed to be better coordinated. So there's this constant swing back and forth, trying to find the perfect way to organize. And the bad news is, and you can leave now, the bad news is that there's no perfect way. We're in a constant struggle to try to find the right way to organize. And it's also a question of different time frames, different countries. So there's no single answer, unfortunately. Okay. So why do we care about horizontality? Why do we care about coordination? Well, several reasons, as you can see. One is that duplicating costs money, wastes money. If you have different organizations doing the same thing, typically it's going to waste money. And it's going to waste time for citizens and for civil servants, but perhaps particularly for citizens. Likewise, duplication creates a very bad picture of government in the minds of citizens. If they have to go from office to office to office to try to get a single function performed, then it creates this image that government is incompetent. The same thing is true for businesses. One of the measures that the World Bank uses for good governance is how much time does it take and how many forms have to be filled out to start a business. And it varies markedly across countries. So one way to look at this is simply that how much duplication is there, how much do you have to fill out the same information on duplicate forms simply to get social benefits, to start a business, to do whatever you want to do as a citizen. But conversely, if there is poor coordination, there may be gaps. There may be certain parts of the population who aren't served. There can be contradictions. You know, my favorite American example is that we have the Department of Health and Human Services that spends a lot of money every year telling us not to smoke or chew tobacco or use tobacco in any form. We also have a U.S. Department of Agriculture that subsidizes tobacco. So what is our tobacco policy? The answer is there isn't one. But there are good political reasons for doing this. There are two different constituencies. The Department of Agriculture's constituent is farmers. So they have to serve their clients. Likewise, Health and Human Services, their clients are the health industries, doctors, nurses, etc. So each of them is doing what they should according to their own mandates, but yet they contradict. And this is only one of thousands of examples one could give of this type of contradictions. I'm sure you could find some in the government of Mexico City. Displacing problems. Again, a lot of my examples, I'm sorry to be American, but I think you can probably fill in the examples from Mexico. A couple of years after 9/11, one fine day, the Department of Homeland Security decided that we now needed passports to visit Canada and Mexico and the Bahamas, which previously we hadn't needed. All we needed was a driver's license. Now, but they failed to inform the Department of State, who issues passports. So overnight, about 4 million people needed passports who didn't have them. A lot of these lived in the US and worked in Canada, or vice versa. And all of a sudden, nobody could do this. So I was one of the people who was caught, my passport expired. And so Luis says, I tend to use my passport a lot. And so I called up the Department of State and said, well, you can have an appointment in 7 months to have your passport reissued. Now, a simple failure to coordinate, a simple failure to talk to each other about this issue. Likewise, we can provide better programs for citizens if we coordinate, so we can produce quality, synergism, and sometimes a simple tidiness, it looks better. Now, I think as Jose Luis implied, and I'll say again, in the year of our Lord 2013, governments tend to be a lot more concerned about coordination than they have been in the past. If you go knock on the doors of the governments of almost any country, any state, any city, you find them talking about coordination more than they have in the past. Why? Why all of a sudden do we care so much about coordination? Okay, one has been the success of vertical management, that is, managing within the individual programs. So even though many citizens would disagree, we do a better job now of managing than we used to do. And particularly after NPM. So for all the problems with NPM, New Public Management, probably internal management in individual departments is better. But part of what NPM did was to divide up government even more. So one of the standard remedies for managerial problems was to create agencies as relatively autonomous, freestanding organizations. Now, once you create more of these group organizations who think they're independent, who are told they're independent, and they're going to act independent, hence less coordination. Likewise, performance management. In some ways, a very good thing. But if I have a set of targets that I have to reach as a manager, and you come and ask me, can you help me with this? You know, I'm going down my list. If that's not on my list of targets, I'm probably not going to. My budget, my department's budget, my job may depend upon reaching those targets. So again, it tends to divide government, to narrow the focus. One of the reasons we care about coordination is this loss of confidence in government. So no matter where you are, even in countries that have had a very good, efficient, effective government, citizens' confidence in that government is now less than it has been. Again, take the Scandinavians. Even there, confidence is dropping. In the US now, public confidence in Congress is less than it is in used car salesmen. That's literally true. So there's this general lack of confidence in what the public sector can do and is doing. And part of that comes from this sense of uncoordination, incompetence that arises out of it. Globalization. Globalization is blamed for everything, so why not this? But anyway, example, Canada. I was interviewing the Minister of Education in Canada one time. And she said when she became minister, she was a former school teacher, she thought she'd be talking to school teachers and principals. No, she was talking to businessmen in the Ministry of Finance. Because in a globalized economy, knowledge is crucial for economic competitiveness. And therefore, she was a major economic actor. And so all this has been pushed together. Same thing is true in the European Union with the Lisbon Strategy 2000. That this globalization, focus on competitiveness in particular, forces organizations like education that previously had to be economic actors to become economic actors. Politics tends to divide us. More coalition governments. So differences among political parties. An ideology of networking makes it important to think of. Now with social media, all these other mechanisms we have, why don't we coordinate? Why don't we talk to each other more effectively? We have the technology. Why don't we do it? So it makes any failure to coordinate appear that much more egregious in terms of the failures. Again, IT produces opportunities. So some fundamental questions. I've been talking about coordination, but what is it? Where do we start? And we usually think about focusing on coordination from the top down, getting people at the top of government to work together. But you can also think about doing it from the bottom up, thinking about getting people who are actually delivering services to citizens to work together more effectively. Example, Centrelink in Australia is an organization responsible for administering all the social and labor market policies in the country. Now, when a client walks through the door, he or she is given a worker whose title is advocate. Interesting title. Because their job then is to advocate, to get what the client needs from all these literally hundreds of programs. So it's the job then of this one organization to put things together at the very bottom, at the level of the client, rather than trying to solve the problems back in Canberra in the national government. So some of the most effective coordination actually occurs around individual citizens, individual clients, rather than trying to get ministers, department secretaries, whomever, to get together on these issues. Do you focus on policy? Do you focus on administration? How do we get there? And then finally, how do we match the vertical and the horizontal? Because you've got two problems going on here. That you're dealing then with vertical coordination between the center of government and states, cities, delegations in Mexico City, whatever. So you've got this vertical problem. And even in unitary regimes, you have the same problem. It may be exacerbated in federal systems, but it still exists in unitary regimes. And you have to put that together with the horizontal coordination, coordinating agriculture, with health, with defense, with all these vertical issues, horizontal issues. So you have to do both simultaneously and do it well. No, that's all you have to do. Now, so it's a very daunting task. It's not easy. No one said it's going to be easy. So, in part, policy coordination is politically constructed. You can think about it in at least three ways. You can probably think about it more, but in my simple mind, I intend to look at it in three ways. Okay, first of all, we can talk about negative coordination. And by that we simply mean, I know what you do, you know what I do, and we get out of each other's way. We don't help each other, but we try not to hinder each other. So we try, again, simply to get out of each other's way. You're not going very far with this, but at least you get rid of some of the contradictions, some of the conflicts. Okay, a more positive strand is what Fritz Schaff, the distinguished German scholar, talks about as positive coordination. That is, I know what you do, you know what I do, and we actually try to help each other. We try to see where we can interact positively, rather than really getting out of each other's way. Then the third level, and the most important level, is strategic coordination. That is, not only do we try to help each other, but we try to help each other around some big goals of government and more future-oriented conceptions of government. So where do you want Mexico City to be in 20 years? And if you want to get there, you've got to start thinking about it now. You've got to begin to thinking strategically about how to move the system in 10, 20 years. And what are the big issues? Health, a better educated population, whatever. But to do that, again, you've got to think about it strategically. Because those big issues, like health, are not merely the province of a Ministry of Health or Department of Health. Health involves dealing with hunger. Health involves dealing with education. Health involves dealing with recreation and sports. It deals with the environment. It has something to do with almost every ministry in government. So in fact, in this book on American public policy that Jose Luis mentioned, I catalog the health programs in the United States at the federal level. Every department at the federal level has something to do with health. So it's a coordination issue. Clearly, HHS, Health and Human Services, is the lead, but if you want to think about health, if you want to think about education, etc., you've got to get everybody on board around, again, the strategic issues. And this isn't easy. So, and I think importantly here is to think about coordination not as merely a technical issue. I mean, we can think about this as solving an administrative problem, and this, that. But it's also very fundamentally a political issue, both in its construction and in its resolution. How do you get people to work together in a political sense as well as an administrative sense? Because some of this has to be driven politically. So one thing that coordination does, I think the experience in most political systems, is that attempting to coordinate is centralizing. Now, we tend to devalue decentralization, devolution, delegation, all those wonderful words that begin with D in English and I think in Spanish. So we tend to value all those things, but at the same time, to achieve coordination tends to drive decisions upward. So again, balancing. How do you balance the virtues of delegation, democratization, decentralization with the needs for central steering? A continuing and almost universal conundrum for government. Now, having been singing hymns of praise to coordination, why don't we do it? If it's so important, why don't we do it? And we've known it's been important since the Song Dynasty in China. There's an interesting paper written by a emperor's, one of the mandarins, Wang Shai, about the need for coordination. It was written about 1000 BC. So this is not new. We've been in this business for a very long time. But why don't we do it? Well, one is simple pig ignorance. English phrase, sorry, I don't know how it translates into Spanish. But we simply don't know what each other does, and we don't share information. So you go down and begin to ask people in a government department, what does your counterpart in Department X do? They give you often a very vague answer, not a very clear answer about what's going on within the system. So some of it is simply ignorance of both what other departments do, but also of what citizens need. So, what do we need to know more? And we need to share that information. Sometimes it's sheer pig-headedness. Sometimes people simply don't cooperate. My daughter is a kindergarten teacher. And so the first rule is, play nicely with each other. And many people in government don't play nice with each other. And some of it is around the next issue, around turf, around power. So power, not cooperating, is a way of keeping your power. And particularly not sharing information is a way of maintaining your power. Example, 9/11 in the United States. If you read the 9/11 Commission report, the Commission says fairly clearly that had the NSA, the National Security Administration, the CIA, the FBI, and the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, shared information, we could have well averted the disaster. But they didn't, because information is power. If I know something you don't know, I have power over you. And particularly in white-collar organizations like government, people hang on to information. And the follow-up reports in 9/11 are that it's still going on. People still don't share information, still don't share intelligence very effectively. Partisan politics. So, if you particularly in coalition governments. If you have members of a government of different political persuasions, then they may not want to cooperate with one another. I've worked a lot with the government in Finland, and there are 6 political parties in the coalition government. And they range everything from the conservatives to the communists. And so naturally, they're not best friends politically. And so therefore don't tend to cooperate very well. Same thing is true in federalism. You have a central government from one political party, a state government from another political party, don't necessarily cooperate very well. So politics always intrigues. Beliefs. Now this is important. I think more so than we sometimes think. That the government departments and the people within them have beliefs. And they have ideologies. So if you go and ask the people in health, how are you going to solve citizens' problems? Make them healthier. The first job I had out of graduate school was working in model cities in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, and the idea of model cities was to coordinate all the programs being delivered in poor neighborhoods in American cities. And so we had 6 poor neighborhoods in the middle of Atlanta. It's actually now where Turner Field is. They've all been torn down, and the big football stadium's been built there. But at the time, these were 6 poor neighborhoods. So our first job was to catalog what was going on there. So we found 56 programs, public and private, that were trying to deal with the issues of poverty in these communities. Then we had to find out what was happening in terms of coordination. Answer, next to nothing. So our job then for the first year was to improve the coordination. And we did. So we found out that people now, if they walked into a department, were much more likely to be referred to other departments than they were before we started. But they still were kept within policy domains. So if you walked into a health department of some sort, you'd be referred, but to other health departments. Not to education, not to housing. So you ask people why. Well, if we get them healthy, then they'll solve their education problems, they'll get a job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You ask the people in labor market programs, well, if they get a job, they'll get healthier, they'll send their kids to school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they had beliefs about how to do things and how to solve clients' problems, how to solve citizens' problems. The famous sociologist, Robert Burton, said that professionalism is the trained incapacity to see the world in other than certain ways. So health professionals see the world some ways, lawyers see the world certain ways, and they're trained to do it. But that makes the coordination, the cooperation, all the more difficult. Professionalism. Time. Coordination takes time. I hear traffic isn't coordinated. But anyway, so coordination takes time. You have to invest in it, and it doesn't occur overnight. And it's also a very long-term process. So you have to build trust, which has to occur over time. I help you today in the expectation that you'll help me tomorrow. So we build up this sort of tit for tat, working together over time. And then finally, accountability. And again, one of these virtues in public administration, accountability is also a barrier to effective coordination. Because you have to be able to track the money, you have to be able to track the legal authority to do certain things. So very soon after he became Prime Minister, Tony Blair had this idea for a massive urban program in Britain, going into the very poorest neighborhoods in London, Manchester, Birmingham, wherever, and trying to solve the problems, bringing together housing, education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Treasury told him he couldn't do it because they couldn't track the money, and therefore he couldn't do it. End of story. Likewise, I'll get back to that now. Okay. I'm running on. So anyway, but accountability, again, as a virtue, also then presents barriers to effective coordination. So how do we think about getting to coordination? How do we do this? So this is like Casablanca, round up the usual suspects. And these are the usual suspects. Plus one, the fourth one, collaboration, maybe not quite so usual. So we think about this through markets, networks, hierarchy, and collaboration. Okay, markets. Okay, markets in the standard neoclassical sense are coordination devices. Markets coordinate buyers and sellers around a price mechanism. So in the simplest form, a market is a coordinating device. Now, it's less clearly applicable in the public sector. But you can think, but there are, for example, programs in housing and healthcare that work on market principles, sharing between purchasers and providers, all of whom are public. So you can think about this. Again, probably not your first option, but one can think about this. Okay. Networks, much more logical way of thinking about coordination. So networks, two types, internal and external. Now, in the best of all worlds, which we don't live in, but in the best of all worlds, a career civil service is a wonderful coordinating device. So if you have a career civil service, people who've been on the job 20, 30 years, have been working in the public sector, they know each other. They can coordinate simply by picking up a phone and talking to their friend whom they worked with some years ago. So this internal mechanism of coordination is often much more effective than the political mechanisms for coordination. Now, clearly, the more institutionalized the civil service is, and particularly when you have a civil service like a Westminster model, where individual public servants work in various jobs throughout their careers. So the average public servant in Britain will work in 6, 8, 10 ministries in the course of his career or her career. And therefore they'll know what goes on all across government. And they've worked in all these ministries. So again, pick up the phone, have tea at the Athenaeum, and you can coordinate. Okay, so in the internal coordinating networks can be crucial here. Committees, working groups, etc., and so forth. Now the external ones also can be effective. That is, when you're connecting government to social actors. Whether these are citizens groups, NGOs, labor unions, employers, pick your favorite external social actor. Again, this is coordination from the bottom up, because then you create networks that work across various programs. Unions, NGOs tend to be working with a lot of different programs, particularly in social policy. So they can essentially be your coordinating device. They can say, Ministry X wants to do this, but you want to do Y. Why don't you guys talk? What's the real story here? So this, again, sharing of information at the bottom through networking and the linkage with formal structures then can provide a very useful coordination device. Now, all these things having been said, the usual response to coordination problems is hierarchy. So when in doubt, you impose hierarchical authority. The simplest, this is sort of the Pavlovian response of most people in government. If it's a problem, use hierarchy. And sometimes it works. Often it works. But there are multiple methods here. Cabinet committees. So you have a cabinet, but you use a committee within that coordinating device. Depoliticize it at least a bit. Ministers without portfolio. As you have ministers in government or in city government, you have a secretary who doesn't have a department that he or she has to defend. They have a general job of trying to help out. So one of my favorite examples is that the British government every session has a Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, there is no Duchy of Lancaster. The job of this person is simply to be an aide to the Prime Minister dealing with the coordination issues to work across the whole of government. Junior ministers who are charged with particular topics. Example, any number of governments now have ministers for families, children, women, immigrants, groups who need a whole variety of services. I did a consulting gig for the government of Ontario a few years ago on children's policies. And I've been working actually with UNICEF on children's policies ever since. You begin to see who provides services to children. Answer, everybody. So everybody in the Ontario government did something for children. But what you do then is to give a junior minister or some analogous person a job of advocating across all these ministries for those clients. My favorite group, another example of this, one of my favorites, is the French for a while had a ministry for the middle class. As if the middle class somehow needed protection, but never mind. Anyway, so again, but the idea is there, even if the example may seem a little silly. Now, okay, another coordinating device which I think is used frequently are so-called super ministries, where you bring together a whole range of pre-existing ministries and programs into one big structure. Homeland Security in the United States, bringing together 22 pre-existing organizations into Homeland Security, trying to make them focus on Homeland Security. Department of Human Resources and Development Canada, so it does all the social policy, all the labor market policies, has about two-thirds of the total federal budget in Canada in one big department. It's been a disaster. Most of these turn out to be disasters, because all you do is internalize the coordination problems. Again, I have to give an example here, sorry. But I think it helpfully illustrates the point. U.S. Department of Defense, okay, created by the National Defense Reorganization Act of 1947 to try to create a common defense structure for the United States. But after however many years, do your math, 166 years, the three major services still have their own cultures, they still have their own procurement services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When Ronald Reagan sent the troops into Grenada to rescue the American students, wonderful story, and it's true, I can verify it. So they did the usual thing, the Navy shipped you lobbed some shells onto the beach, and then the Army got in their boats and landed, but the Navy kept shelling. Now, it turned out that the Navy's radios couldn't talk to the Army's radios. They were in a common Department of Defense, but they'd been bought by two different procurement systems, and no one ever thought that they had to talk to each other. So the clever Army captain found his AT&T credit card, found a phone booth, called the Pentagon, and he said, "Would you please tell the Navy to stop shooting us?" Now, it seems insane, but it's true. So, when you create these super ministries, you don't get rid of the organizational cultures overnight. You don't necessarily get rid of them in 60 years. They're going to persist. But you think you've solved the problem. And sometimes that's worse, because you think you've solved the problem. Central agencies, ministries of finance, treasuries, personnel, budget offices, and so forth. But often these proliferate, so you have to coordinate the coordinators. Because everybody, again, thinks they're in charge. And if everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. Use procedures, particularly budget procedures, to try to coordinate. Performance management. Now, I said 25 minutes ago that performance management is a barrier to effective coordination. But it can also be a benefit. Example, what the Kiwis, New Zealand, did. They had this really fantastic system of performance management based upon two levels. The first is what they call strategic policy areas. Strategic results areas. Again, what are the big strategic issues you want to solve? So you want to create a healthier New Zealand. Great. Now, then you move this down and you have key results areas. So what does each ministry contribute in a more measurable sense to that strategic result? And again, there you're using performance management in a very strategic way, trying to use it around these big policy issues. And believe it or not, George W. Bush tried to do something like that in the US government. Sorry, that was a main political announcement. Anyway. And then the final mechanism to talk about briefly are what we call US czars. And here the notion is you give an individual the responsibility for coordinating in a policy area. The classic case has been the drug czar. So again, under the Reagan administration, we created the Office of National Drug Policy, but headed by an individual with a lot of personal authority. And his job was to try to bring together the 4, 5, 6, 10 federal organizations that were dealing with drug policy. And again, having a lot of authority, but also then having a lot of accountability. And we've been doing it since. So President Obama has created somewhere around 26 czars, most of them during the financial crisis. Tony Blair had about 15 when every time there was a crisis, he created a czar. And again, but it's a way then of trying to focus on the issue and give somebody the responsibility to coordinate it. And then the fourth of my mechanisms is collaboration. And this is a concept from Eugene Bardak at Berkeley. And here the notion is, if we want to really integrate policy, we have to create essentially common ideas about what we're trying to do. And his notion was that the only way to really solve coordination issues is through creating ideas. So, social policy. A, what's the problem? And then secondly, how do we solve it? Again, every department that's dealing with social policy, every ministry, perhaps every civil servant, has their concept of what the social policy problem is. But then how do you frame it together to produce a common understanding of the problem that you're trying to deal with? Now this is very hard work because it involves a lot of negotiation, a lot of bargaining, a lot of sharing of ideas among individuals. But if it's done, it's extremely effective. So again, it's a question of investment. How much is one willing to invest in creating coherence among the policy interventions in order through this reframing process? So let me try to end with some questions. I think I'm a bit on time. If I'm not, apologies. One is coordination versus strategic management. Do you simply try to get people to work together, or do you try to work together around this vision, this longer-term set of goals? And again, in this case, does firefighting, to solving short-term problems, drive out coordination for the long term? Do you work with structures or processes? So do you build elaborate structures, or do you merely build more flexible, collaborative processes? And the Finns here are a very good example, very quickly. I was a consultant. I'm very proud of this. I was a consultant for the Prime Minister of Finland for 2 years, building a process of coordination around what became to be called program management. So the idea here then is you have this process of building cooperation around 4 or 5 big policy issues for each mandate. So every election, the government decides, what are my 4 or 5 big issues? And then you build a horizontal structure that matches the vertical structure. And on 3 months or 6 months, sometimes administrators' policy targets are much shorter now than politicians. But still, you've got to think about time. You have to try to match time perspectives. Clear goals or a process. That is, can you measure coordination? Very difficult. But you want to have clear goals Because if you do, you're very likely to fail. And if you fail, everyone says, oh, we failed, we can't do this, forget it. Versus the understanding that this is an ongoing, continuous process. It has to be continuous because the policy problems change, the environment changes. A structure you build today might not work in a year, might not be relevant in a year. Then finally, is coordination always the answer? Again, hymns of praise, coordination. But also, one can sing hymns of praise to specialization. You have to balance the two. There's some rationality of redundancy. If a program is important, you may want to have redundant systems. If there's a crisis around, say, around a dread disease, you want to be sure that everybody is vaccinated. It might be good to have two organizations working on this, checking each other. Mutualism, mutual control. Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal had created multiple organizations doing the same thing so that they could compete and also watch each other. You can't coordinate effectively scientific or creative activity. It's hard to coordinate universities and science. As someone said, trying to coordinate a university is herding cats. You can herd sheep, but you can't herd cats. So forth. Uncertainty. We don't know what the world's going to be like tomorrow, much less in 5 years or 10 years. So you have to, again, have to build in flexibility. Over-coordination essentially strangles creativity and stifles adaptation. And then finally, accountability. So thanks very much for being here and for your attention.